My husband walked out of our marriage on a Tuesday morning, 38 years after I said I do. He just did not tell me that was what he was doing. He told me he was going to the hardware store. He never came back. I buried him 3 weeks later, or I buried someone. That part I did not understand until the afternoon I walked into the pharmacy on Greenfield Avenue and heard him laugh. His laugh is not something you can mistake. I have tried, since then, to explain it to people, and I always come up short. It is the kind of laugh that starts low, almost a cough, and then opens up suddenly, like a door blown back by wind. In 38 years, I heard that laugh across crowded rooms, through walls, from the other end of our backyard on summer evenings. I heard it in my sleep for months after the funeral. I was so certain I would never hear it again in waking life that when it reached me from the next aisle over, my first thought was that I was finally losing my mind. I was standing in front of the vitamin display. I remember that specifically because I was trying to decide between 2 bottles of magnesium and thinking about nothing important. Thinking about the ordinary nothing of a Thursday afternoon when the sound traveled around the corner and stopped me where I stood. I did not move for a long moment. The bottle in my hand felt very heavy. Then I walked to the end of the aisle and looked. He was standing at the pharmacy counter, one elbow resting on the edge, the way he always did, slightly turned to the side. Gray at the temples now, more than I remembered. A little thinner in the face. But the shoulders were his. The way he held his head was his. The small gesture he made with his right hand while he spoke, a loose circle in the air, was something I had watched him do 10,000 times across a kitchen table. I said his name, just once, not loudly. Robert. He turned. I watched his face go through something I could not name, a sequence of expressions that moved too quickly to read. Then it settled into something careful and still. "I am sorry," he said. "I think you have the wrong person." His voice was the same, even the register of it, the slight roughness he always had after noon. I had fallen asleep to that voice. I had heard that voice say my name in the dark. "You are not Robert Ashby," I said. It was not a question. "My name is Frank," he said. "Frank Delaney." I looked at his left hand. The wedding ring was gone, but the slight indent where it had sat for decades was still there, a pale groove pressed into his skin. "Show me your right arm," I said. He frowned. He did not move. "The scar," I said, "from the kitchen accident. The one you always told people was from a fishing trip because you were embarrassed." Something crossed his face. Just for a second, a flinch he could not fully suppress. Then he straightened. "I am sorry for whatever you are going through," he said, and turned back to the counter. He signed the paper the pharmacist slid toward him without looking at me again. He picked up the small white bag and walked toward the exit. I followed him. I am 67 years old, and I followed my dead husband through a pharmacy parking lot on a Thursday afternoon because my feet made the decision before my brain could weigh in. He got into a silver car, a newer model, nothing I recognized. I was parked 4 rows over. I ran. I am not built for running anymore, and I did not care at all. I pulled out behind him when he turned onto the main road. My heart was doing something alarming. I kept 2 cars between us, the way I had seen people do in movies, and thought the entire time that I was either a grieving widow in the middle of a breakdown or I was following my husband who was supposed to be in the ground. By the time he turned into a neighborhood I had never visited, I had decided it did not matter which one it was. I needed to know. He parked in front of a house with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. Real flowers. The kind someone tends to. He got out of the car and walked up the front steps without hurrying, the way a person walks to a door they know. Before he reached it, it opened. A woman stepped out, younger than me, by at least 15 years, maybe more, short hair, dark red. She was wearing a canvas apron with dirt on the knees, the kind you wear when you have been in the garden. She smiled when she saw him and reached up to touch his face with one hand. He leaned into it. I sat in my car with the engine still running. A boy came around the side of the house, maybe 11 or 12, holding a baseball glove. He said something I could not hear, and Robert, or Frank, or whoever he was now, turned and held out his hand for the glove and tossed it back underhand, easy and practiced. The boy laughed and ran back around the corner. The woman watched this and smiled again, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. Then they went inside. The door closed. I drove home on autopilot. I do not remember traffic lights or turns. I remember pulling into my driveway and sitting there for a long time, looking at the house where I had lived for 31 years. The house Robert had chosen with me. The house he had painted twice and re-roofed and installed the back deck on. The deck where we ate dinner every summer until his knees made the stairs difficult. The house where I had fallen apart for 7 months thinking he was dead. I went inside and I called my son. Derek answered on the second ring, which was unusual. He almost never answered quickly. "Mom, hey, you okay? I need you to come over," I said. "Is something wrong? Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt," I said. "Come over, please." He arrived in 40 minutes. He had his jacket on over what looked like pajama pants, and I understood that he had come fast, that he had been worried. I felt a wave of something toward him, something warm. I held on to that feeling carefully because of what came next. I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten 1,000 family dinners, and I told him everything. The pharmacy, the laugh, the parking lot, the house with the flower boxes, the woman and the boy, and the easy way Robert had thrown that baseball glove like a man entirely at home in his life. Derek listened without interrupting. He was very still. I noticed that, how still he was. Derek is not a still person. He fidgets, he checks his phone, he taps his fingers. He gets that from his father. He was doing none of those things. When I finished, he looked at the table. Not at me. At the table. "Mom," he said, "you have been through so much this year. Grief does things to the mind that we don't always, Derek, recognize as grief. It can make you see, Derek." I waited until he looked up. "Do you know something?" The pause was 4 seconds. I counted them. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Yes, you do." He looked away again. His jaw moved. I watched my son, my 39-year-old son who I had raised and loved and worried over and celebrated, work through something behind his face that he did not want me to see. "Tell me," I said, "right now, tell me." What came out of him then was not one clean confession. It was a collapse. He bent forward over the table and covered his face with his hands, and the words came out broken and out of order, and I had to hold them all together myself to make them make sense. Robert had told him 8 months before the accident. He had not used the word affair. He had said there was someone else, had been someone else for a long time, and that he wanted to end his marriage and start over, but that ending the marriage would cost him everything he had built, the pension, the property, the investments, 20 years of careful saving. He was 64 years old, and he did not want to start over with nothing. Derek had begged him to tell me himself. Robert had refused. What Robert had done instead, what he had spent 6 quiet months arranging while I cooked dinner and watched television beside him and believed completely in the ordinary life we shared, was find a way to disappear that looked like dying. There had been a man, Derek said this part quietly, not looking at me, a man Robert had found through someone he knew, the details of which Derek claimed not to know, though I was not certain I believed that. A man who was ill, who had no family to speak of, who had agreed to a transaction I could not entirely absorb. The accident on Route 9 was staged with great care. The car was Robert's car. The identification was Robert's identification. The man was badly injured in the crash and died in the hospital 2 days later under my husband's name. The casket was closed. The funeral director had cited the extent of the injuries. Derek had stood beside me at that service and held my hand while I wept over a stranger. "You knew," I said. "You knew the whole time. Mom, you held my hand at the funeral." I didn't know what to do. He said if you found out, you'd lose everything anyway because the money had already been moved. He said this way at least you'd have the house, the life insurance, I repeated. He stopped. "I am the beneficiary," I said. I collected his life insurance. Derek's face went a particular color. "And you," I said slowly, carefully, "you were named in the business accounts, the investment portfolio." He said it was the only way to make sure you were taken care of. "How much?" I said. He told me. I sat with that number for a long moment. I thought about the 7 months I had spent in this house unable to sleep, calling his phone just to hear his voicemail, wearing his cardigan around the house because it still smelled like him. I thought about the grief counselor I had seen twice a week for 4 months. The one who told me what I was feeling was normal, that there was no timeline for loss. I thought about the stranger in the ground with my husband's name on the stone. "Take me to that house," I said. "Mom, that is not a good idea. I am not asking your opinion. Take me there, or I will drive myself." He took me. We did not speak on the way. When we turned onto the street with the flower boxes, Derek slowed without being asked and parked where I told him to. We sat there in the dark for perhaps 10 minutes. A light was on behind the living room curtains. At one point, a shadow moved across it. Derek started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears running down his face while he stared at the steering wheel. "I wanted to tell you," he said. 100 times I picked up the phone. "But you didn't call," I said. "No, because of the money." He did not answer, which was its own answer. I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about who he was at 7, at 14, at 25. I thought about how much I loved him. I thought about how that love was not going anywhere, and how it also did not change a single thing about what he had done. "Take me home," I said. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen under the small light above the stove, and I thought with great precision and patience. I had spent 38 years being the kind of woman who responded to things, who adjusted, who made the best of situations that had been decided without her. I had been good at it. I had believed for a long time that this goodness was a virtue. I understood now that it had simply been convenient for everyone else. 3 days later, I walked into the office of a woman named Sandra Price, who ran a private investigation firm on the 2nd floor of a building downtown. I had found her through a friend who had used her years ago during an ugly divorce. She was direct and unhurried, and she listened to everything I said without expression, which I appreciated. "What you're describing involves insurance fraud, identity theft, and financial crimes," she said when I finished. "This goes well beyond a marital situation." "I know," I said. "I need documentation, not suspicion, proof." She named a fee. I wrote the check without discussion. I told her I wanted bank records, property records, the identity he was using, and anything connecting my son to the financial transfers. "Your son," she said carefully. "My son," I said. Over the next 10 days, I watched the house on Greenfield from different positions at different hours. I wore a hat and sat with coffee and learned his schedule the way I had once learned the schedules of my children when they were teenagers, and I needed to know where they were. He left every morning at 7:40. He returned by 6. On Saturdays, he worked in the garden. On Sundays, he drove the boys somewhere, soccer or baseball. I could not tell which. He looked content. He moved through his life like a man with nothing unresolved. I took photographs. My hands were steadier than I expected. Sandra called me on the 11th day. "Come in," she said. I have enough. The folder she placed in front of me was thick and real and devastating in the way that only documented truth can be. An identity established using a birth certificate that had been altered. Bank accounts opened 5 years earlier under the name Frank Delaney, into which nearly $1.5 million had been transferred in increments designed to avoid reporting thresholds. Property records showing the house had been purchased 14 months ago, 2 months before the staged accident, which meant he had been planning this while sleeping beside me, while we watched the evening news together, while he told me he loved me on our anniversary. Utility accounts and phone records tying that address to Robert Ashby for years before the accident. A second household, a second life, running parallel to mine, paid for with money that was half mine. And then, at the back of the folder, what I had already known but needed to see in black and white. Phone records. My son's number appearing regularly in the log connected to Frank Delaney's prepaid phone. Calls made the week before the accident. Calls made the week before the accident. Calls made during the months I was in grief counseling, during the months I was barely sleeping, during the months I was learning how to be a widow. I closed the folder. "Thank you," I said. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and made a list. Not an emotional list, a practical one. What I had, what I needed, what order things needed to happen in. I had always been organized. It had never served me so well as it served me now. I called Derek the following morning. I let my voice be tired. I let it be soft. I said I was not sleeping and that I needed to understand everything before I could move forward. I said I needed to hear it from him directly, all of it, so I could try to make peace with it. He came that afternoon. He talked for nearly 2 hours. I asked questions in a low voice and he answered them, relieved, I think, to finally have somewhere to put it all. He told me about the transfers and who had authorized them. He told me about the accountant who had processed the business asset restructuring. He told me the name Robert was using on his tax filings. He told me things he did not realize were evidence. He did not notice the small recorder on the kitchen counter. I had placed it near the fruit bowl, which had been there for 20 years, and he did not look at it once. When he left, he hugged me at the door. He held on longer than usual. I hugged him back. Then I called my attorney. She reviewed everything in 2 days and called me on a Friday morning, her voice measured and clear. What I had was sufficient, more than sufficient. She filed with the district attorney that afternoon. The fraud charges alone, she said, would take significant time to work through. The insurance fraud compounded it considerably. The financial crimes added another layer. And the matter of the man in the grave, the false identity used to collect a death certificate, was a federal concern. I thanked her and set the phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The deck Robert had built was still there. The wood had aged and would need refinishing. I had been meaning to have it done. I had put it off because it felt like something that should wait, like the house was in mourning too, and I should not change things yet. I called the contractor that afternoon. The warrants were served on a Wednesday. My attorney called me when it was done, early morning, the sky still gray outside my window. I listened to her voice, and then I sat in the quiet of my kitchen with my hands around a cup of coffee. Somewhere across the city, my son was being processed. Somewhere in a neighborhood with flower boxes on the windows, the life Robert Ashby had built on my grief. And a dead man's name was being pulled apart at its foundations. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because people sometimes assume I must have. What I felt was more like the morning after a very long storm, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful exactly but is real, the kind of air that is clear because something has been stripped away. Derek called me 40 times over the next 4 hours. I did not answer. His wife called twice. I did not answer her either. My phone became a thing that was happening at a distance, like noise from another room. At 2 in the afternoon, I drove to the house on Greenfield. I did not park down the street. I pulled up directly in front and got out and walked to the door and rang the bell. The the woman answered. Up close, she was younger than I had thought, early 40s at the most. She looked at me with the careful politeness of someone who does not know what she is looking at yet. There was a dish towel in her hand. "Can I help you?" she said. "I need to speak with Frank," I said. "It is important." She looked at me a moment longer, reading something in my face that she could not quite name. "He is in the kitchen," she said, and stepped back to let me in. I followed her through a house that was comfortable and lived in, a house with shoes by the door and drawings pinned to the refrigerator, a house that looked nothing like a lie from the inside. He was standing at the counter. He heard us come in and turned, and then he went absolutely still. "Miriam," he said, and then caught himself, because that was not the name he was supposed to know. The woman looked at him. "That is not my name anymore," I said. "You don't get to use my name. But I will tell you what mine is." I set the envelope on the counter between us. "Those are legal documents. You should read them carefully." He picked up the envelope. His hands, I noticed, were not steady. He opened it, and his eyes moved down the first page, and the color left his face in a way I found, if I am being honest, quietly satisfying. "What did you do?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I told the truth," I said. "That is all. I simply told the truth to the people whose job it is to act on it." The woman was looking at him now with a different expression. The dish towel had dropped to her side. "Robert," she said. "Not Frank. Robert," she said. He did not look at her. "You told me your wife passed," she said. Her voice was very even, the voice of someone keeping themselves very controlled. "Years ago you told me that." "He told me a lot of things too," I said. I looked at her directly. She was not my enemy. I had understood that, watching her through a car window weeks ago. She had been lied to as completely as I had, just in a different direction. "I am sorry," I said to her, "for what you are about to find out. None of it is your fault." She sat down slowly on one of the kitchen chairs. Outside, I could hear a siren, still far away, but getting closer. Robert turned to me. His face had changed completely. He looked like something had been removed from it, the architecture of a life that no longer existed. "For everything we had," he said. "For everything we were to each other." "What we were to each other was real to me," I said, "every year of it. And that is exactly why you will never fully comprehend what you did." I walked back through the house with the shoes by the door and the drawings on the refrigerator. I let myself out. I walked down the porch steps and back to my car, and I sat there with my hands in my lap while the sirens came closer and then stopped. I did not watch them take him. I had already seen what I needed to see. The legal process moved forward with the slow, grinding certainty of things that are well documented and true. The identity was voided. The accounts were frozen and then unfrozen in the right directions. Assets that had been transferred, hidden, restructured under a name that did not exist, were pulled back into proper order by the courts. It took many months. I attended what I was required to attend and answered what I was asked and let the machinery of it run without trying to rush or direct it. Derek accepted a plea agreement. The sentencing came on a gray October morning, and I sat in the courtroom and looked at my son in a suit he had bought carefully for the occasion and thought about the small boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long car trips. I held both of those things at the same time. I did not try to make them resolve into one feeling because they did not. We spoke once, a brief call, after everything was settled. I told him I loved him because I did, because that was not something that had been taken from me. And then I told him that love was not the same thing as absence of consequence. He was quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said, "I know, Mom." He sounded older than I had ever heard him. He sounded like someone who had finally, at great cost, grown up. Robert did not go to trial. He had a stroke 6 weeks after the arrest, a significant one. He survived it, but the recovery was long and the legal proceedings were adjusted accordingly. There was no dramatic courtroom ending for him. He pled to reduced charges from a hospital room and was sentenced to supervised release given his medical condition. I was asked if I wanted to be present at the sentencing. I said no. I had already said what I needed to say to him in that kitchen, and I did not need the law's architecture to complete it. What I needed had already been taken care of, slowly and by my own hand, in the weeks between a pharmacy on Greenfield Avenue and a folder full of documented truth. The grave on Elm Hill still stands with his name on it. I visited once, in the spring, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. There is a stranger buried there who had no family to mark his passing, who died in a hospital bed under a borrowed name because someone had decided his life was worth less than their convenience. I brought flowers. I stood there long enough to mean it. Then I left. My life is different now, in ways I did not expect, and in ways I should have. It is quieter. The house feels larger than it did, or maybe I have learned to take up more space in it. I redid the back deck, and I eat dinner on it in the summer, alone sometimes, with friends other times, and both versions feel equally like mine. I sleep through the night. I did not think I would again, but I do. I spent 38 years being a woman who was good at adjusting to things she had not chosen. I adjusted to his long hours and his moods and his way of making decisions and his habit of spending money without telling me, and all the small and large ways he had occupied more room in our life than was his fair share. I had called this love. I had believed for a long time that these were the same thing. They are not the same thing. I understand that now in a way I cannot fully put into words and can feel completely in my bones. What I learned in the end was not about him. He was what he was, and what he was cost him everything he thought he was protecting. What I learned was about the woman who had been standing quietly to the side of her own life, waiting to be seen, waiting to be told who she was, waiting for someone else to decide what she was worth. She is done waiting. Whatever time I have left belongs to me. I intend to use it accordingly. There is a version of this story where I stay in the vitamin aisle, where I convince myself that grief plays tricks, that a laugh can echo and fool a tired mind, that 67 years of living have simply worn down the edges of my perception. I almost chose that version. It would have been easier in every measurable way to put the magnesium back on the shelf and walk out of that pharmacy and go home and make dinner and continue being the widow everyone expected me to be. I did not choose that version. And I have thought often about why. I think the honest answer is that some part of me had already known for a long time. Not consciously, not in any way I could have named at the kitchen table or explained to a friend, but somewhere underneath the ordinary movements of 38 years, something had been adding things up quietly, logging small discrepancies, noticing the gaps between what Robert said and what Robert did. I had not listened to that part of myself. I had called it anxiety, or unfairness, or the particular loneliness that comes from being in a marriage where one person is always slightly elsewhere. What I understand now is that silencing that voice was not patience. It was not kindness. It was something I had been taught to call virtue, and it had cost me decades. The thing about deception of the kind Robert built is that it requires the cooperation of the deceived. Not willingly, not consciously, but the architecture of it depends on a person who will not look too hard, who will accept the explanation offered, who has been shaped by years of small moments into someone who doubts herself first. He knew me well enough to know I was that person. He had, in some ways, helped make me that person. That is the part that sits heaviest when I let myself think about it. Derek knew too, and Derek's choices are the ones I carried differently, because love is involved in a way it was not with Robert, not by the end. What my son did was a failure not of intelligence but of character, and character is not fixed. It can be damaged by fear and rebuilt by consequence. I believe that because I have to, and also because I watched his face when the sentencing came down and saw something in it that looked, for the first time in years, like clarity. Whether he does anything with that clarity is his work to do. I cannot carry it for him. What I can say is this: there is no version of my story where the truth was not worth finding, not for justice, not for the legal outcomes, not for the money, though all of those things mattered. The truth was worth finding because I was worth finding, because a woman does not stop being a full person because someone has decided to treat her like furniture, like a budget line, like a problem that could be solved by staging a death and walking away. The intelligence I needed was not complicated. It was the willingness to look at what was in front of me, to follow a thread even when following it felt frightening, to sit with a folder full of documented facts and let them mean what they meant. Courage does not always look like bravery. Sometimes it looks like a 67-year-old woman in a hat, sitting in a parked car with a cup of coffee, learning a stranger's schedule. Sometimes it looks like placing a recorder near a fruit bowl and keeping your hands still. I am not the woman I was before I walked into that pharmacy. I am something quieter and sharper and more entirely my own. Whatever years I have left, I intend to spend them as that woman,